Thanks for joining us on the program today, Diplomatic Ties. Our focus today will be post-Marrakesh 2016. The Convention of Parties on Climate Change held in Morocco, Marrakesh, and what were the core issues? Follow up to the Paris Agreement. But on Diplomatic Ties today, we shall be looking at the reality, the politics of it, the economics of it, and indeed the transactional aspect of this whole thing that centers on climate change. My guest on the program today is a seasoned diplomat, former Permanent Secretary, Minister of Foreign Affairs, and a recipient of the Presidential Distinguished Public Service Award, His Excellency Ambassador Bulus Lolo. Thanks for joining me on Diplomatic Ties.
Thank you, Atian. Thank you.
Our focus on the program today again is post-issues from Marrakesh 2016, focusing on climate change. They call it COP22. This and more after this time out. Stay with us.
Coming 1 year after the Paris climate deal and days since its entry into force, COP22, as this Marrakesh conference is called, is the crucial next step for governments to reinforce responsible collaboration as well as achieve a collective shift towards a new sustainable development model.
I call on developed countries to honor their commitment to mobilize climate finance, $100 billion by 2020 to help developing countries to mitigate and adapt to climate vulnerability.
At the very center of our work lies the vital need to make climate action a cornerstone to the transformation to truly sustainable development.
What is at stake is the very existence of man. It is therefore our joint duty to work hand in hand to protect humanity.
In his statement, President Muhammadu Buhari expressed optimism that the conference will mark another milestone in the collective aspiration of the international community towards addressing the menace of climate change. He stated Nigeria's ambitious but achievable commitment to what he called green growth, in line with the platform of change on which his administration was elected.
This commitment comes from the recognition of the grave social, economic, and environmental threats that climate change poses to humanity. We believe that pursuing these programs will not only reduce emissions and improve climate resilience, but also stimulate growth and economic opportunities in the private sector. Our goal is to make Nigeria one of the world's best examples of how reducing emissions can benefit the environment and the economy.
The president used the forum to alert the international community that in Nigeria, the larger dimension of the challenge posed by climate change goes beyond emission rights to that of survival, warning that if nothing is done, the human and financial cost will be colossal.
The Lake Chad Basin, for example, has shrunk to a mere 10% of its original size, and this has seriously affected the livelihood of over 5 million people and contributed in the growth of insecurity in the region, including the emergence of Boko Haram as a terrorist group. Hence the urgent need to resuscitate Lake Chad.
With Nigeria's instrument of ratification for the new global agenda on climate change already submitted, President Muhammadu Buhari called on world leaders to recommit themselves to the goals of the Paris Agreement for the benefit of this and future generations. For sure, the earlier threat by the United States President-elect Donald Trump to rip up the agreement on climate change is generating concerns among participants. But President François Hollande of France has formally allayed their fears, saying no one country can abolish the Paris deal, which he described as irreversible in law. He, however, promised to spearhead discussions with the Trump administration towards ensuring that the United States' commitment to climate change remains unwavering. From Marrakesh, Morocco, Adamu Sambu.
I saw Marrakesh 2016, that is COP22. I believe the next one will be COP23.
Right.
From 4 perspectives.
Okay.
The politics of it, the economics of it,
Right.
The environmental issues clearly, and the way forward.
Right.
So let me start this way.
Right.
COP22 is coming at the exit point of UN Secretary General Ban Ki-moon. He's on his way out, and by the time we hold COP23, we'll have had a new Secretary General. And from his statements, he said, if I may not be exact, he said he knows he has not taken the world there regarding climate change, but he hopes and believes his successor will take it from where he has taken it, and if they sustain the tempo, climate change issues will get and the emissions will literally come down. So let's look at the politics of it, the position of the U.S. before now and after now.
Well, I'm happy that you have identified the politics behind climate change. And for a start, what does COP stand for? It stands for Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Since the adoption of that convention, it means there have been 22 sessions coming every 2 years, and it alternates. COP22 just ended in Marrakesh, as you mentioned. Behind it all, there is global politics in climate change. Some see it as fiction. And if you go to a small island developing state today like Tuvalu will tell you that they face a real risk of extinction. They will be swamped by sea level rise. That's the politics behind it. Those who face the risk know what it is and regard it as an existential problem. And those who are removed from the immediate risks see it simply as people being hyper over nothing. And that's why behind it all, people bring their interests to bear. The real big emitters have been emitting now for decades on end.
When you say the big emitters, who are they?
Of course, we know them. The industrial West. But in the West, the big economies, the United States, one would mention, is a big emitter. China is a big emitter. India, Brazil, just take it that those big manufacturing countries are real big emitters. And so if you put together the constellation of interests, there are those that I've said who face existential threat. There are those who also are mindful of their economy or economic base. And so if you look at it from the point of view of economic production or the point of view of existence, there has to be a point at which people will say, what is happening? Here in Nigeria, we are we are victims, in fact. The Lake Chad is drying. Lake Chad is less than 25% of its previous volume, and it's drying by the day. Unless we do something, one day we'll wake up. That expanse of land that was once a lake will cease to have a drop of water. That's the reality of it. And in the sessions before Paris last year, there has always been this debate about what do we do to control the increasing and increase in rise of temperature levels globally. You do have years in Nigeria when we have less rainfall and others where the rain start late and end sooner than we used to know. These are all the concrete evidence of the tweak in our climate.
I know initially the big emitters,
right,
some actually saw climate change more or less like fictional, not real.
Right.
Do you think their position have changed now?
Some
given
have,
the discourse in the front corner.
But like I was saying to you, that it's all driven by one interest or the other. And that's why the geopolitical politics comes to play. And if we don't get away from it and face the reality of surge, we had our worst flood in this country in 2012. How did that come about? A clear case of the climate change phenomenon that we're facing. And if we then continue to play politics, one day we'll wake up and it'll be too late. Which is why when you talked of the outgoing Secretary General saying that he hopes his successor, if nothing, will take the efforts a little further. I can say that the new Secretary General coming in from January, being European, is very sensitive and conversant with climate change. And I don't see that under his, during his tenure, that he will toy with the gains that have been made. The real danger now we face is the United States. Whether President-elect Trump, when he takes office, will carry out the threat that he will pull out of the Paris Agreement, I hope not. But if he does, he will bring us back many steps, which is why in his statement during the Marrakesh meeting, the President of France, Francois Hollande, did not mince words in calling on the United States to remain faithful to the Paris Agreement.
Okay, so before we go into specifics,
Right.
I knew Nigeria had a position. How can or how will the entire globe, the world, come together, working together in the character of the program we are discussing now? This is diplomatic ties, to drive home positively issues that will help combat the challenge posed by climate change.
You know, the reality of climate change is that its worst victims are the least emitters. So those who contribute the least are the ones suffering the most from the effects of climate change, which is a tragedy. Now, always in international politics, there has to be consensus for action to be consistent and sustained. Paris was a difficult summit, but thankfully the outcome was robust, because at a point it looked as if there would be no agreement in Paris. And if there had been no agreement, that would have meant there was no successor to the Kyoto Protocol. And it was the Kyoto Protocol for once, even though not all were signatories to it, that gave a platform, that gave direction, and gave structure to actions needed globally to at least minimize the effects through what they call in the industry adaptation and mitigation.
Okay.
Now, those are measures that all countries are required to take.
Okay.
You adapt to the changes and also take preventive measures which mitigate against climate change.
Okay. So back home,
Yeah.
Mr. President led a huge delegation within the environmental subsector,
Right.
name it. And I know that there are a couple of UN initiatives that Nigeria has bought into.
Right.
We have the UN RED, Sustainable Forestry Management, Community Forest Management, and above all, he hinged his address on the fact that Nigeria needed collaboration support from other climes
Right.
to boost the receding Lake Chad region.
Which I mentioned.
So what kind of diplomacy can we play to really get this attention?
Sustained advocacy.
Okay.
Sustained advocacy. We must never tire.
What if they remain, you have sustained your advocacy and they're impervious to it?
Yeah, of course you can never force them to respond. But then we have to look at other ways to demonstrate our commitment to the cause, because it's a cause that we must embrace as a country. And across the length and breadth of Nigeria, there is no section of this country that you will go today without one evidence or the other of the effects of the adverse effects, in fact, of climate change. In the southeast, the erosion we are witnessing it's a good example. And in the north, the encroachment of the Sahara Desert is there for all to see. Estimates say that by 2030 or thereabout, we would have lost trucks and trucks and trucks of land measuring kilometers in the north due to the encroachment of the desert. And so if we cry to the international community and, as you said, they seem impervious, let us take steps of faith by putting our money into what we believe we must do.
Okay.
It may not be much, and I know that efforts are ongoing. There was in March this year, I think, or thereabout, March, May, I don't remember now, but there was the security summit that took place here in Nigeria, that brought together our neighboring countries. And
Yes,
some,
yes.
you know, the Lake Chad issue came up, and again, studies have been conducted, financed by Nigeria, thankfully. It remains for the capital to be sourced. Public institutions, and I mean governments here, do not have that type of capital. We must bring in the private sector. We must also bring in philanthropic individuals and organizations to look at the Lake Chad issue as a life and death issue. Because were we to overcome the menace of Boko Haram today in the northeast, but those in the area lack a legitimate means of livelihood,
Okay.
you still have them migrating.
So will you say Nigeria's presence, Nigeria's huge presence at COP22
Right.
was worthwhile?
Very commendable.
Did we drive home our message?
Mr. President articulated it well, and he presented it. Of course, he's been very upfront in presenting, having a way of, you know, putting it in stark terms where you don't need too much to see that unless something is done, there is real danger.
Okay.
Yeah.
Our discussion on diplomatic ties today is on post-COP22, moving on the way forward regarding climate change in the world, the politics of it, economics of it, and the environmental issues. The discourse continues after this time out.
The Africa Renewable Energy Initiative was launched at COP21 in December last year. It seeks to achieve at least 10 gigawatts of new and additional renewable energy generation capacity by 2020 and at least 300 gigawatts by 2030. Germany has also committed to provide 2 million euros to the project.
The African Development Bank has committed itself to invest $12 billion over the next 5 years in support of accelerating electricity supply in Africa, and to leverage between $45 and $50 billion from the private sector. The bank will work with the African Union and other partners to fast-track the Africa we want. And certainly the Africa we want must be an Africa that's not in the dark.
We believe that the African Renewable Energy Initiative and its African ownership can play a vital role in building capacity in Africa to develop a modern, reliable energy system.
Mr. Adeshina emphasized that Africa must have universal access to electricity within 10 years. That is why the African Development Bank is highly supportive of the Africa Renewable Energy Initiative. It will enable Africa to move quickly to adopt modern distributed energy systems that are renewable, smarter, and able to reach people without access to modern energy services. Aisha Bello Mustafa.
Okay.
Comparatively, past SecGens and the outgoing Secretary General,
Right.
Ban Ki-moon, we'll talk about the incoming.
Right.
Given his strides within environmental issues, do you think he really drove the world in that direction?
He did.
Okay.
He did. And I think coming from the Asia Rim, he brought to bear the Asian spirit of simplicity. He also brought what one may say a cultural trait to his approach. You would see that he enjoyed, not necessarily did he have it all the time smooth, but it was a relatively quiet engagement, very, very respectful individual he is, did not carry himself with any airs. And he too was quite fortunate that apart from the spike in terrorism, the global challenges that he had to deal with compared to his predecessor were limited. Of course, it was during his time that we had the NATO attack against Libya and decimation of the country. But generally, he would go down as a Secretary General that tried to move the world towards consensus building. He tried to move toward greater partnership, and he moved toward solidarity.
No,
Yeah.
I don't have a dossier of the incoming
Nor do I.
Secretary. Beautiful. But I know with your track record, you have a snippet of him. If you ask now as a diplomat,
Right.
because no one can tell. Given your track record, sometimes
Right.
someday they could say, there is one ambassador, Bulus Lolo, in Nigeria.
Right.
We need him for this office.
Right.
And what would be your petition before the incoming UN Secretary General? Okay, as you take off on issues of climate change, follow up here, follow up. What will you tell him?
He is coming with a very rich political pedigree, having been Prime Minister of Portugal. He has engaged at a very high level internationally, and he's aware of the structure of the world. He's also coming in at a time when there's a dramatic shift from the world we had before now and the new world that we are waking up to.
How do you
which
mean here,
is-
sir?
I'm referring, of course, to a European Union without the
Okay.
United Kingdom. I'm referring to the United States with a far-right president who some say is very unpredictable, and equally during his campaign made so many promises, and most of which were an appeal to a group that wants to remain in an enclave. So I pray that the Secretary General will not fall into the temptation of seeing the world in a small cocoon. We must open up and engage.
Okay.
We must embrace the diversity that exists in the world. We must also be willing to throw a hand of friendship and brotherhood when the world needs it. Portugal, like I said, or the Secretary General incoming was the Prime Minister of Portugal, so he's a seasoned politician. He will need very little briefing to understand the undercurrents of global politics.
Okay.
But what he should be ready is the real power base of the United Nations,
Okay.
which is the Security Council.
Okay. Finally, sir,
Yeah.
on climate change, back to
Right.
climate change, it thrives or dwells on sustainability.
Right.
And if you sustain the message, you sustain the safeguards, we could come of it. So playing around it,
Right.
what last words do you have for Nigeria vis-a-vis its relations with other nations within the ambit of climate change?
Well, climate change, like I said, is a thing that brings the world and then plays up different interests. There have been numerous commitments made. Some are for countries which we did commit to our nationally determined commitment, NDC. If we keep faith and do what we must do for our own sake, it will be good for us. And equally, we must not shy away from reminding others that their practices, their actions are causing incalculable harm to us. And of course, my last word on it will be, we must remain vigilant and take those actions that enable us to adapt and mitigate against the effects of climate change.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Your Excellency,
Thank
Ambassador Bulus Lelo. It was
Thank
nice
you.
talking with you.
Thank you.
That's about that on the program today, and we believe you had it in, very thoughtful on diplomatic ties today, the politics of it, the economics of it, and indeed the way forward regarding climate change issues in the world. As we move on, the hope is that if the entire world come together ties-wise, the campaign of surmounting the challenges of climate change in the world will really be surmounted. Thanks for being our guest, and be our guest same time on the same channel. On behalf of all of us, thanks for watching. Bye-bye.